Welcome, everybody. We can see participants entering our webinar. We will be starting on the hour, but you're most welcome to this Real-World Evidence for Decisions webinar about improving rare disease real-world data availability and quality for HTA payers. Welcome, everyone. We can see that participants are just joining, but it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Real-World Evidence for Decisions webinar about improving rare disease real-world data availability and quality for HTA and payers. My name is Karen Facey, and I'm a Senior Health Technology Assessment Advisor with the Real-World Evidence for Decisions Learning Network. And if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that the Real-World Evidence for Decisions Learning Network is an HTA payer-led multi-stakeholder initiative that seeks to bring together experts from all stakeholder groups to engage in dialogue, to consider how fit-for-purpose real-world evidence can be generated over the life cycle of highly innovative medicines. And we consider all aspects of the life cycle, thinking about horizon scanning and how that may be able to identify the products that might need real-world evidence and help in that planning, identifying what questions real-world evidence may be able to help in terms of HTA payer decision-making, clarifying how real-world evidence will be assessed by HTA and payers, and then post-launch, considering what real-world evidence may need to be generated to resolve uncertainties. That's our mission. And if we go to our next slide, you'll see that that mission is supported by a great range of stakeholders and individuals here shown in our steering group. You can see that we're led by HTA payers up there in green, including a payer, Hans-Georg Eichler from Austria, international organizations such as OECD, patient representatives, clinicians, analytical experts, academics, and registry holders. We're supported by a range of industry organizations, including UCOPE, and they provide the funding for the Secretariat of the Learning Network. And if we go on to our next slide, it's my pleasure to be co-moderating today's session with Victoria Hodgkinson from our steering group, who is Executive Director of the Canadian Neuromuscular Disease Registry. And I'll be handing the floor to her in a moment to give us her ideas and set the scene for this webinar. But to give you a flavour for what we're going to do in the next hour and a half, if we move to the next slide, you'll see the agenda, that we will have a keynote presentation from Professor Maurizio Scarpa, who takes a leading role in the Metabolic European Reference Network. The reference networks have been developing registries for rare diseases for many years, and Maurizio will be sharing not only past experience, but also future intentions and opportunities for us all to be working together to create better real-world data to improve the care of people living with rare diseases, and particularly from our perspectives on helping us understand how we can evaluate new medicines in this field. We'll then have reflections from a range of stakeholders, from an industry perspective, from a patient perspective, and from two HTA bodies, both in Europe and in Canada. We will then move to a wide-ranging discussion amongst the panelists, and we ask you to put your questions into the Q&A box so that we can have a discussion which addresses the issues you want to talk about. And we will close at 16:30 summertime here in Central Europe. So without further ado, I'll move on to the next slide and ask Victoria to set the scene for us. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Karen, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm very excited to help moderate and lead some of this discussion today on very important topics. As you heard from Karen, my name is Victoria. I'm our executive director, as mentioned, with the Canadian Neuromuscular Disease Registry, and also our CSO at a company called Lumio, where I've been working for over a decade with teams to build registries in Europe, North America, Asia, and Africa, both national and international rare disease registries adapted to a specific geography, regulatory, and healthcare context. And I share that not really as credential, but as context, because the conversation we're about to have today is one I've lived from the inside across multiple diseases, multiple health systems, and multiple continents. So, as you all know, rare disease presents one of the most profound challenges in modern healthcare, not just in developing treatments, but in demonstrating their value. So we know there is approximately 300 million people around the world living with rare disease, and less than 5% of those conditions have approved treatment. But when innovative therapies do actually reach the patients, the evidence base on them is often fragile. They're built on small trial populations, short follow-up periods, and endpoints that may not fully capture what matters most to patients and their families. So this is really where real-world data comes in, or rather, really where it should come in. So really from my experience, when you have a decade of running and building registries, you learn very quickly that collecting data is the easy part. The harder question, and the one that keeps evolving really underneath you, is whether the data you're collecting is the right data, whether it's structured the right way to actually serve the decisions that matter. So, in my experience in SMA and spinal muscular atrophy, with our work in Canada, and also through the Treat NMD International Global Network, where I've sort of led and supported that building of the SMA work, interoperability across the world, we've really seen firsthand where registries can grow and expand and adapt to speak the same language, to be able to pool patient data from across the world to generate evidence that can help inform HTA and payer decisions and demonstrate long-term outcomes for therapies in a way that clinical trials really can't support with small patient numbers. And really, in my work in our company at Lumio, I've seen that same challenge play out differently and repeatedly across geographies. So, what works really well in a well resourced European health system with established data infrastructure looks very different from what's needed in an emerging registry ecosystem in Asia or Africa, where really the foundational building blocks are still being laid. And each context really demands its own careful adaptation, but yet we all have the same goal to generate data that's reliable, comparable, and meaningful enough to support real decisions around patient access and value. But really, the most important lesson that I've driven from taking a long-standing existing registry and adapting it to meet today's data sharing needs is one of the most difficult things you can ask of a registry. The infrastructure, governance, data fields, reporting frameworks, these were built in a different era, and retrofitting them while continuing to serve patients and clinicians who depend on them, while simultaneously sort of aligning with these novel guidance around data quality and interoperability that are coming out of HTA organizations worldwide, is a slow and painstaking and often humbling process, but it's one of the most urgent things our field needs to get right. Because without it, our data will continue to fall short of what HTA bodies and payers actually need to make confident, timely coverage decisions. And so that tension between what we have and what we need now is really why this conversation is so important, why no single stakeholder alone can solve this problem, and the spirit of why we're all here today behind real world evidence and decisions in this webinar. So we'll hear a lot, as Karen mentioned today, on sort of some of the evolving work in the European health space, some other work around the world that's happening, and from our multi-stakeholder perspectives. And really hoping that we can really set the stage and bring together these perspectives, move beyond our shared recognition of the problem, draw on learnings and experiences from each of our groups, and really chart a path forward. So with that, I think we'll get into it, and I'd like to turn over to Professor Maurizio Scarpa, as you heard, coordinator of the European Reference Network for Rare Hereditary Metabolic Diseases, amongst a long-standing background and experience, to share his experience and perspective. Thank you, Maurizio.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much, for this opportunity to have indeed this talk regarding such an important issue in rare diseases at the moment. So now I will share my screen, and tell me whether you see it in the proper way. Is it okay like that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for this invitation, because it is absolutely important in this moment to really speak about data, about stakeholder, about collaboration in rare diseases. It's a golden moment for the rare diseases at the moment, after so much we have done in understanding what a rare disease is, and especially how to develop therapies and try to shorten the diagnostic. As Victoria was saying, just to set the scene, we're speaking about rare diseases, which is actually a number of field of 7,000 or more disorder, which are singularly very rare, but altogether they affect at least 6% of the population worldwide. One person every 15 actually has or will have in his life or her life a rare disorder. And actually, the major problem with this disorder is that most of the time they're still having quite a lot of odyssey in the diagnosis. They are geographically very much dispersed, and there is also a sort of literature and systemic data collection which is not optimal. And we have a lot of registries. Only in Europe, we have about 1,000 registries for rare diseases, but most of them are not interoperable. And living with a rare disease is really not only a problem, a clinical problem, but it is also a social problem. You see here in this slide that the burden calculated in the US in 2019 is about $966 billion of dollars out of pocket of the families to treat patients. So we have really a responsibility as a rare disease community to transform the infrastructure in Europe in particular, to use health data in a proper way to shorten and to speed up and to ameliorate the quality of life of these patients. We are lucky that since 2017, so almost 10 years, in Europe, and only in Europe, we have the European Reverse Network, and the European Union actually decided to, inside the cross-border directive, to elect one article, Article 12, in order to create networks, specialized network, all working together to bring medicine at the bed of the patient, and not having the patient going from one country of the European Union to another one. And we have created 24 different networks, now spanning more than 1,600 specialized units and almost 400 high-level excellent hospitals. And for each of them, each of the 24 ERN, there is a registry, which is not only a disease-specific registry, but it is actually a rare disease registry. I'm lucky to lead the metabolic ERN, which is formed by 100 hospitals in 27 countries, plus Norway. And they say 100 because we still keep, scientifically speaking, the UK member inside our organization, although beside Brexit. And we have the registry, which is the unique pan-metabolic registry, the Unified Inherited Metabolic Disease Registry, which is the first European registry treating and taking care and data from all the more 1,400 inherited diseases that have been classified so far. The ERN registries are not administrative tools. They are living scientific instruments, and they have data that make these registries interoperable. And actually, we are interacting quite a lot with EMA and other local and international agencies in order to raise data, which can be very useful to regulators, HTA bodies, payers, researchers, and patients in particular. So what has been achieved so far? Actually, we have all together the common data elements, which are really raised in a fair principle, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, We can create longitudinal natural history studies. We can have a cross-border case discussion and virtual consultation, because we can use a compare patients from different countries to see their difference. And we know that in rare diseases, there is not one single patient that is identical to the other patient, even in the same family. And these registries have been more and more important for the EMA regulatory submission and post-authorization studies, and also for managed agreement. We have already still some persistent challenges. Of course, the data entry is still a burden because we are underfunded and under-supported, but we are working on that. The physician can contribute, but rarely there is an analytical output or research results, and the heterogeneity of data standard across national and disease-specific registries may sometimes impede the aggregation. So, I mean, we are still working on this. We have a lot of experience now, and with the European Commission, we are really working on these challenges in order to have these registries as more useful as possible for our tool. In particular, what we are doing is to create a consortia of National Institute of Health or other agencies, together with the research clinicians and patient advocacy group, in order really to implement these registries and to make an advancement regarding data management and coordinating centers. So the ERNs, speaking about data, are becoming an infrastructure and are coordinated with also other structures that are important for data collection. So why is important to have a registry and a data registry? Because I mean, here the registry are really important for the regulatory agency, the EMA, like the HTA payer, joint clinical assessment, and national reimbursement for clinical research. In particular, rare diseases are mostly lacking of natural history studies, patient empowerment, because to participate to the registry data, and also to collect some epidemiological data in order really to study the burden of the different disease. And then they are extremely important for the research and development of industry, because we know that more than 90% of our patients do not have a single therapy, and we need indeed to use this data to help industry to develop new data. The EU HTA regulation actually create a demand for real-world data from the ERN registry in the joint clinical assessment, and there are agencies that now have initiated pilots in order to use this data. And the challenge is, of course, to create a prospective design registry to serve the payer in order to really show the clinical utility of this. So the multi-purpose use of the real-world data is not just a future aspiration, but it is really a reality, and we are really creating the design and the governance of this. So another important moment that we have in Europe is the release of the European health data space, which is really transforming the real-world data from aspiration to the legal framework. I'm sorry that there are some typos here. It's the conversion from Mac to the computer. The European health data space actually has established a legal right of secondary use of electronic health data, and creates a health data access body with interoperability standard. And it is also very well done in order to have a cross-border data linkage and provide a fair data framework. These are all characteristics that the ERNs registries have. And this is implication, for the ERNs, indeed, for the interoperability, and to create a legal pathway for the HTA bodies and pay to access the ERN registry under defined condition. And also to the patient, this is very important, because, if we use the secondary data in rare diseases, we can even highlight patient at risk with not knowing to have a rare disease. Of course, this is a a very big act that has been done in Europe. It is considering Europe as a unique state in which we have hub and spoke of data generation, and the implementation of the European health data space will really make the data analysis much more useful also in rare diseases. Taking into account all that I said so far, what we have done recently was to create an action that was coordinating all the ERNs, all the registries, everything that the ERNs can do inside the health leadership mission for rare diseases, having all the 24 ERNs collaborating together with the major political stakeholder and other stakeholders like industry, patient organization, agencies, payers, and the 24 ERNs in this action in a 3-day meeting in which Ursula von der Leyen, Roberto Metsola, and Antonio Costa were informed about what we have done, and with the participation of ministries from different member states, and with the endorsement of Oliver Varelli, MEP Zakarieva and Ribeira for the importance of rare diseases in Europe, and also the participation of important stakeholders like Emmer Cook, who is the executive director of EMA. I mean, this activity actually moved quite a lot of the information on rare diseases. We were able to identify 8 priorities that are all very similar in importance, that we are now developing in 8 working groups, so that all these stakeholders are working together to really indicate how to act and how to really make everything, all the unmet need to the patients in a very operative way, and to advance the development of therapies, in particular to give Europe competitiveness, leadership, and independence, especially now in a very difficult geopolitical moment, which is seeing Europe between the US and China world that is really leading all the biotech and shrinking a little bit our activity. And indeed, one of these priorities, the creation of the comprehensive rare disease infrastructure cluster, which is what I said at the beginning, a new way of infrastructure that is collecting all the different clinical basic research and all the agencies in a group of rare diseases to create an infrastructure which is coordinated to create collaboration. So this action actually was able to attract an incredible number of political and stakeholder attention. And now we have created the HLM for Rare, which will have another meeting in December, where we will present the work of this working group. So the strategic priority is actually can be summarized in the 6th point, which is the sustainability of the rare diseases in Europe through the ERNs, the fact that we need to have an integrated data ecosystem connected between the national registry, the regional registry under the European health data space, and adopting the FAIR principle. This will lead to an accelerated diagnostic and also to the reusage of data for the artificial intelligence use in a cross-border way, and then to have potentially data to discuss about equitable access to therapy in a patient center, and in particular being useful to the Biotech Act, of which I will speak a little bit later. What is the Biotech Act? The Biotech Act is actually a European Commission document that is a comprehensive regulatory framework, to create competitiveness for Europe in the biotechnology and biomanufacturing. I'm sorry for this bad slide. So what is the Biotech Act that is offering? First of all, across the member state, it is done to reduce the time to trial for rare diseases. Now we have 27 systems of deciding how to do clinical trials. This means that Europe is doing 1/10 of the Chinese clinical trial and 1/5 of the US. And our time to start a clinical trial is about 6 times higher then the rest of the world. What we would like really to discuss about is to have a sort of 28 regime, which is what Ursula von der Leyen proposed, to have an overarching legislation to finalize and to speed up the decision, inside Europe. So this is something that is extremely important, and indeed it will enable also to have a unified platform for trials, and also to enhance the possibility of studying drugs in Europe. And this will be integrated with the real world evidence data from registries, and will be important for the regulatory and the HTA decision. So this means that indeed, together with the possibility of the ERNs, the collaboration of ERNs inside the European system, we can really have a speed up in competitiveness and leadership for rare diseases for Europe. So altogether, the ERN, the European Health Data System, the Biotech Act will create a transformative ecosystem for rare disease. With the ERN registries, we can connect all the data that is necessary inside the European Health Data System framework. We have all the legislation that is needed, and inside the European Biotech Act, we can really implement all this capability in a very actable system. So what it is important is that the multi-stakeholder really collaborating, the ERNs and the physician, to design registries that to generate data according to the European Health Data System compliance, for the payers and the HTA body to engage early the registry design and define what the data they need. For the industry, invest in pre-competitiveness data infrastructure, and to use the registries as an extra control arms for clinical trials. And of course, this will be very useful also for patient organization, regulator, policymakers, because they can participate to co-design data collection, to provide clear guidance, and also to fund the ERN data infrastructure. So, I mean, not a single stakeholder can solve this alone, but this kind of architecture, the fact that we have clinical networks that are collaborating now with scientific entities, we have a legislation, and we have a future activity, a future act to implement all these we have created so far. We really give the rare diseases a very good hope. So what each stakeholder group must do now? For the aged body and payers, I mean, actually, we can discuss today how we can really formally embed the registry into the HTA process for rare diseases. What will be the governance structure that is ensuring data quality and independence? Of course, for the patient organization, which are at the center of our work, how the patient move from data contributors to data co-owners. This is a very important topic that we need to take. And what is the mechanism ensuring the patient group to receive a meaningful feedback on the data that they provide? Of course, this discussion will need to be done also with the industry. And when there is no robust real world data system, what is the industry responsibility to build one, how they can really participate, and how they can make a collaboration between structure under the European Health Data Space and the Biotech Act. And for us clinicians, how we can design the next generation of registries, starting and using the ERN registries in order to recognize and sustain the physician engagement. So actually, I think that now the rare disease community has never had a better position to act. This is a golden moment where we have all the experience, all the data, all the coordination, all the ERNs, and the committed people in the politics in order really to create a policy window, a legal framework, and a clinical infrastructure which remain really at the heart of the Biotech Act and the legislation we have in Europe. So as a conclusion, I think that the real world data is not a technical problem. It is really a tool of governance, incentive, and collaboration. The real world data really can solve the policy and can help the policy in the advancement for rare diseases. So we have, as we said, the registries, and in particular the ER registries, which can be really very useful after the European Health Data space, which is providing the legal and technical framework to make a pan-European real-world data use a reality. The now action that is also attracting and working on the political side to commit and to translate into concrete measure the unmet need of the patient and to coordinate all the tools that we have. And now we have this year the prospect of the European Biotech Act, which is really the legislative vehicle to codify all these commitments toward the development of new ways of diagnosis, new ways of creating therapies, and new ways of collecting data to identify better and to serve better the patient. Of course, we need a multi-stakeholder collaboration because this is the only model that we can have to have this everything in reality. And with this, I give to Victoria back the platform, because I think that now all these things can be really discussed all together and to try to see how we can move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Maurizio, for that lovely introduction and discussion of what's happening sort of within the European health data space and the ERNs. And with that, we are going to move on to our panel discussion. And so our first panelist, we'd like to welcome the industry perspective from Alessio Amadasi, who is the Vice President Medical Affairs within the EU International Rare Diseases Unit at CEST. And with that, I think our question to you, Alessio, is where do you, as an industry individual, use real-world data within the life cycle of development in rare disease medicines?
Thanks, Victoria, for the nice introduction. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Coming to your question, I think that to be very simple, we can say that we use real-world data. We need to use real-world data before the clinical development, during the clinical development, and also after the clinical development, the post-approval phase. When we speak of before clinical development, even before starting first human studies, real-world data can be extremely important to gather insights on the disease natural history, so better understanding what is the disease trajectory in untreated patients. And this is really important also to better identify the unmet needs in this patient population and to better design our clinical studies, in particular also the selection of the study endpoints that may be more relevant for patient caregivers. Another ancillary advantage that we can gain from availability of real-world data, for example, in the form of patient registry during the stage before clinical development, that this is allowing us to identify where patients, in particular for ultra-rare condition, are being followed, are being managed. So to identify sites, clinical sites that are most involved in the care of a given disease and that can be involved in the clinical development of our drugs. When coming to the clinical development phase, I think that real-world evidence can represent an important tool to supplement additional data, both for regulators and payers, compared to what we generate just with randomized clinical trials. In some cases, when we speak of, again, ultra-rare condition, where running controlled clinical studies may be difficult due to the very low number of patients that can be enrolled in the studies, having high-quality real-world data may allow us to exploit external comparator arms that are built based on real-world data to provide a control to what we observe in patients undergoing therapy with our investigational drugs in the interventional single-arm control study, single-arm studies. So this is something, for example, that as Chiesi, together with our partner company, Santera, with biotech company, we were doing for a very rare disease, Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, where we have been able, with the MEA, to provide confirmatory efficacy evidence for a drug that was already approved, an oral drug for this kind of patients, by using a natural history control arm to an interventional study that we were running. So this is for sure an important opportunity that can be exploited thanks to real-world data. When coming to the post-approval settings, real-world data can, on one side, allow us to collect long-term efficacy and safety information. For example, by being able to follow in the long term patients that were previously enrolled in clinical trials without needing to keep them in open label extension interventional study. This is reducing the burden for the patient, also the investigators, is reducing the burden from an economic viewpoint in terms of cost for the pharma industry, but may allow still to collect by using, for example, registries, long-term efficacy and safety data. We are sometimes more and more frequently, as mentioned by Professor Scarpa, exploiting real-world data, for example, collected through disease or drug registries for fulfilling post-approval safety commitments. So this is something that is common use of real-world data. I think that more and more it is also useful to exploit data collected under routine practice to capture the perspective of patient and caregivers, and thanks to patient-reported outcomes measure, and to complement what we have been observing during clinical trials with patient-reported outcomes measure. For example, again, we've been recently publishing an international survey on patient and caregivers affected by alpha-mannosidosis, which is a very rare lysosomal storage disorder with a prevalence of more or less 1 in 1 million. So in that case, for example, the possibility to collect through a survey direct data and perspective from from patients and caregivers was allowing us to dig into aspects like self-care or mental health that were more difficult to be monitored during the standard clinical trial. So that was providing important complementary information. So all in all, to come back to your initial question, really, real-world data is a hot topic for the pharma industry, a big opportunity to generate more evidence and to complement the evidence that has been that is built during the clinical trials. Obviously, we need to apply proper methodological approaches and understand the perspective of the different stakeholders in terms of how to manage real-world data in a way that is satisfactory for everyone and fulfilling the needs of everyone. But I see it as a big opportunity and a big need for the pharma industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Alessio, for that perspective, and an excellent segue into our next panelist, who now sort of bring in the patient perspective. So with that, we will transfer over to Francois Houillet, who is the Information and Access to Therapy Director, Health Policy Advisor at Eurodis. So Francois, welcome. And based on what we've just heard, and our question leading into the patient perspective is, how can rare disease patient groups be involved in real-world data collection that could help inform HTA and payer decision-making? What are the opportunities and issues within that scope?
Thank you very much, Victoria, and hello to everyone. I think that first, we should ask the question, how can patients be involved in these registries and other sources of real-world data? First, to inform consensus guidelines and meetings with clinicians where together we define and understand how patients can best be treated, the so-called treatment guidelines. We can gain knowledge from clinical trials, from registries, and then decide which treatments are best for which patients at which stage of the disease, if they are first line, second line, third line, if there are subgroups of patients, subpopulations with special attentions, which treatments are recommended, which other treatments are less recommended, because when exchanging on all these aspects based on the information we can gain from registries, then we are best prepared as a group, but also as individual experts, best prepared to take part in HTA, best prepared to discuss how future clinical trials should be designed. That is for the European cooperation on HTA to inform joint scientific consultations, but also we are best prepared to propose different PICOs, different questions that the developer needs to respond to based on all these discussions from data from the registries. And doing so, we can best play the role we want to play in the HTA process to start with. And we can only do that, and that is a real challenge, if the data which are collected from different registries are first standardized. Not only we don't always have the data we need, but when we have them, they are not always the same. There is large variability among assays done, used by different centers. Even centers of expertise may have different ways to collect, to capture the exact same data, and then it becomes extraordinarily complex and lengthy for regulators or for HTA experts to analyze the data and to interpret them. And I think here there is a clear role for patient groups to compare which data are collected by which registries, and when they're not the same, where they differ significantly, to push their clinicians to standardize this data. The third aspect is that patients should be involved more than they are today in the governance of the registries and of other sources of real-world data. I won't detail, but we did an analysis of the EMA catalog of all sources of real-world data. A minority of those are involving patients in their governance. For the European reference networks, we estimate, based on a survey, that 66% of them involve patients in the governance, but for 40% of the consent forms for patients to decide to join a registry or not, no patient were consulted. And there are European reference network registries with high dropout rates, well, as much as 40% of the patients who decline their data to be collected in the registry, probably because the consent process was not fully appropriate. So on the different roles patients can have, and we can discuss this in the question and answers, I think it's clear on our side what it means to be involved in the governance of registries, but we need really to organize this more than to discuss co-ownership of data. Data are a public good. Health data are a public good. Nobody owns the data. They are not part. These are not part of the material goods. They are part of the extra patrimonial law. So instead of discussing who should own the data, nobody owns the data. They are public good, but we can certainly take part in the governance to discuss who can access the data, how, for what purpose, and maybe in these first words to conclude with this most important aspect, to always share the findings of the data, of the studies, the new knowledge gain with the patients who take part in the registries. There are excellent academic initiatives where patients receive very clear and simple and concise information on everything that has been gained, and then they are encouraged to provide more data themselves and to invite other patients to join the registry. And I think this is where we need to push the efforts. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Thank you, Francois, for that excellent perspective of where patients can play a role. And I think we've heard clearly across the life cycle from both the industry and the patient organizations. So with that, will move to our next speaker in the panelist, moving into the HTA perspective. We'd like to welcome Wim Hutch, and apologies for my name pronunciation, but who is their specialist advisor HTA at Zinn. And Wim, our question for you is, are real-world data from disease registries used in HTA?
Oh, thank you, Victoria. And don't be alarmed about not actually speaking my name well. I think we're quite aware that Hoots is still very hard for anyone who's not Dutch. Yeah, I just want to build a little bit on what has been mentioned before, but just to give you a very general answer to your question, yes, I think, of course, real-world data are being used in HTA. The question is, however, where and how, and then we can also go back to the life cycle. And I would like to go back to some of the other speakers' comments. For instance, I think for us in the Netherlands, disease registries are a very important part of what we call horizon scanning. So if we want to know what's going on, where the new treatments are coming, we use information from disease registries just to know about their basic epidemiology, about the prevalence, the incidence, about current treatment patterns. And quite commonly, actually, this is also the start of what we call being a triage between HTA bodies, clinicians, and patient representatives to discuss, well, what is coming, what is meaningful for us, and what do we need to do to prepare for these treatments coming to us. And then I think a little bit following up to what Francois was saying, that this information is also very useful to actually provide input to the clinical trials which are coming. So some of that data might actually be used in the work we do as part of the joint scientific consultations. Say, for instance, word information about, well, what treatments are currently being used. So what could be comparators in a possible clinical trial, but also, most importantly, what are the most relevant outcomes we would like to see from an HTA perspective. So registries already can provide that information. Then if we go a little bit further, I think a lot of the work we do, and I will go back a little bit to the Dutch practice, is about what we would call appropriate use. When these drugs are available and being used, we are interested to see, well, who is actually being treated? What is the outcome of the treated? Do we go to the right patients? So just to give you a few examples, in the Netherlands, we have a big registry on cystic fibrosis, and actually also referring to Francois, this is a patient-led registry. And there we actually try to get more information on whether the effectiveness of the treatments, for instance, the new Kaftrio treatment, is just as we would expect from the clinical trials. And can we get a little bit more input on what would be the long-term outcomes of this treatment? Could we actually identify specific groups which would actually respond better or less on that treatment? And finally, can we give clinicians some handles to say, well, when do we start? Or then when do we actually want to stop with the treatment? Another example is that we had done some work in a registry project, which I was involved in, on hemophilia, where there's a Dutch registry called Hemonet, where there's also very active participations of patients, where we actually try to look at new drugs, how were they being used, and how was that actually replacing already existing treatments. So there is a lot of work going on. I think one of the questions we sometimes have is that we all feel it's very useful, but it's sometimes so hard to really determine what's then the impact on what's happening, the impact of in terms of reimbursement, but also in the impact of prescription in clinical practice. And it's something we do not always know. And I think that is still something we have to find out, what is really impact of using registries on for instance, daily prescription, daily clinical practice. One other example which I would like to refer to is something which we have in the Netherlands, which is conditional reimbursement. It's not something we use very often, but in very rare cases where we have questions about treatments, we might use that to actually say, well, we're going to reimburse this treatment, but there is a kind of question to collect all this data. And we do that sometimes with very rare diseases. So an example which we recently was actually taken up in this conditional reimbursement was the treatment of a metachromatic leukodystrophy, MLD. And there we have the treatment Limeldi. And actually, while it was being reimbursed for most of the patient populations, there's still a question about the juvenile early symptomatic patients, where there's a question whether you actually are on time if you give a gene therapy or too late. And then you can ask yourself whether it's really worthwhile to actually give that kind of very expensive gene therapy. So there is a conditional reimbursement where we base ourselves also on a patient registry, which is international because the number of patients is so low that you would never actually could do something like that with a national registry. I think we will see one patient every 2 years in the Netherlands. So that already indicates that you cannot do that on a national level. Finally, I think it's important to say a few words on the initial assessments, because I think there's a lot of question, well, do you want to use registries a part of the initial assessment you do for HTA? And I think that we still struggle over there. We still, from an HTA perspective, prefer to see RCTs, even in rare diseases. But occasionally we will see, and I think more often we will see single-arm trials which are matched to external controls which come from registries. I think there, even if we don't like it, we have to think very carefully how we can do this well, and especially because sometimes we see that the use of registry is more perceived as a kind of afterthought than really being linked to the clinical trial, the single-arm trial. So we have to be very careful. Personally, I think as HA bodies, we're not so fond of single-arm trials, but we can have situations in which this is probably the only situation where you can do that. But then if you want to have external controls, you also have to think very carefully in advance how you would actually use those registries to get the external controls. How would you match? How would you ensure that these data are as comparable as possible? So, well, I think this is a little bit for a start, and I think that Nicole probably has also very similar, but also very different experiences from Canada.
Excellent, thank you, Wim. And with that excellent segue, we will transition to our last panelist. And we've heard the European perspective across the multi-stakeholder groups. So now coming outside of Europe, we'd like to turn over to Nicole Mittman, who is the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence at Canada's Drug Agency, to share a non-European HTA perspective. So welcome, Nicole. Thank you. And our question for you is really, Canada has investigated the use of real-world data to support policymaking in rare diseases. So what has that really told you about the potential for use of data from registries to inform the Canadian HTA practice?
Oh, well, thank you, Victoria, and thank you to the speakers already ahead of me, and thanks for the invitation. Actually, I will say, maybe I'll start with, this is really excellent timing for this webinar. We have just yesterday announced our third stream and call for a request for proposals for rare disease registries to fund the improvement or fund the improvement in the quality of the registries themselves. And this was funded through the National Strategy for Rare Diseases through Health Canada. It's a real opportunity to think differently about the registries and actually bolster or improve the quality so that that could be used to inform decision making. And so we're in the midst of just having that announcement go out. And in doing so, we're looking at things like governance, we're looking at things like participation, and looking at other items such as outcomes. And when it's interesting that sometimes, depending on the origin story of the registry, they may be created initially just for, here's a connection to a community that really is an underserviced or non-connected community. Especially if there are very few people in the country that have a disease, it's often a lovely way to connect patients, caregivers, family members. But then there's the request to, how do we use registries to actually inform decision making? And then that requires a little bit of a different sort of perspective in terms of, what are you collecting? And we heard earlier about governance, consent. Do you have steering committees? What is the infrastructure? Are you collecting data in a similar way? We're also thinking about participants in that way, and certainly, can we increase enrollment? What kind of populations are included in the various registries? Are there subpopulations that are missing from evidence packages that come through randomized clinical trials? And also outcomes. There are outcomes that are clinical outcomes, there are resource outcomes, there are patient-reported outcomes, all important for decision making. And so as we're thinking about using registries or using evidence in a different way, because our randomized controlled trials may not be able to provide us with that kind of evidence that could help with the context of the work that we're doing in terms of reviewing the value of a technology. These are opportunities for us to use evidence from different parts of the evidence pyramid, and registries or real world evidence really offer us an opportunity to do that. So maybe I'll also talk a little bit about the other things that we're trying to do, and very similar to Wim is, how do we appraise the value, or how do we appraise the technology, and with what evidence do we do so? Sometimes we need some foundational work, and we heard earlier, listening into some of the earlier speakers talk about the governance part of it, or what can we start to include, and some of it is around, can we develop roadmaps? Can registries link? Are they accessible? How is that an opportunity for us to think about using that registry to inform decision makings? We've also developed assessment criteria for real world evidence, which applies to registry data. So what is the, as Wim said, interesting about single arm studies, health technology assessment is really a comparative analysis. And without a comparator, how do we do that kind of work? So is there an opportunity to think about assessment criteria, and what are the kinds of outcomes people are looking for from a decision-making point of view? We also have been bringing together different communities, whether that is patients, patient groups, caregivers, industry, data holders, to really bring that community together. And I heard very clearly about this is the time to do this. We have opportunities to connect with all of us to make sure that we're collecting the right kind of information, and really to inform not only the effectiveness or the safety or patient-reported outcomes, using that sort of engagement across a number of different partners in the community. And then also to help direct what kind of information is really important. What is meaningful to patients? What is meaningful to the system along the way? And one can only do that with a collaborative, coordinated effort. Maybe as an organization, one of the two initiatives I'll point you to that we've been working on have been our deliberation framework. So our deliberation framework not only includes clinical and economic, but also includes unmet need. So is there a burden? Are there other treatments out there? So trying to understand those kinds of parameters associated with technologies. It also includes information on ethics and equity, and then also health systems. And so as we're thinking about new technologies and looking for information to populate those 5 domains, registries or real world evidence actually do provide an opportunity to provide that context or input into the evidence that then goes to our deliberation work. Maybe finally, I'll just add we also have a program that is sort of our life cycle program. It's also our sandbox program, where we talk about bringing in new technologies that have already been in the system, but haven't perhaps gone through a formal health technology assessment. And we do that perhaps, if you think about in the pediatric space, there often aren't clinical trials for pediatrics. They're in adult populations, but yet pediatrics are a population that could be that could benefit from that particular technology. And so often those kinds of technologies then don't have a formal clinical trial program, and actually do need to have real world evidence. And so they might be best practice. They might actually have databases. They might have registries as well along the way. And so that program allows us to bring in different kinds of data across the life cycle from sources such as registries, and then also from other RWE. Maybe just the last thing I'll say is that, Wim talked about impact. What is the impact? And I always always think about impact as sort of three things. Does it inform, support, or change something? And we're at the point of looking at RWE to inform and support. And I don't think we've gone to the point where this has changed a decision just on its own. It might be used in context to help with a deliberation recommendation along the way. So maybe I'll stop there, Victoria, and leave it to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nicole, for that perspective. So wrapping up from our panelists, I think now we're going to transition to the Q&A. So please continue to put your questions into the chat. You can upvote questions as well if you would like, and we'll move over into asking some of these questions to our lovely panelists.
Thanks, Victoria. That was a great discussion, wasn't it? And you can see it's generated a lot of interest in our audience because we've got lots of questions. So I'm going to combine some of the questions together. We can see there the first two questions from Giulio Zaspuria and from Sula Bartola, I think can be brought together by a question about how much do we put into a registry? Because there's this balance, isn't there? That if we're saying a registry should collect data and be used for many purposes, does that make it too large and overburdensome? But then on the flip side of that, we know that rare diseases are highly heterogeneous, and the example is given here by Sula of Rett syndrome, where we know there's heterogeneity in the way the disease presents and therefore in terms of the outcomes that matter. And then you have the heterogeneity of the decision makers. We know that what the HTA and payers want is different to what the regulators want, is different to what clinicians want. So I wonder if any panelist has any thoughts on how do we create this balance of collecting sufficient data to be able to inform decision makers without making it overburdensome on either clinicians or patients. Francois.
Maybe I'll start with the example we have in France with many national registries for rare diseases with now millions, 1.2 million of patients, where it started for and with epidemiological research, gaining extremely precise information on most rare diseases, and then adding other domains, and always as part of a dialogue with regulators and industry, for example, collecting data from compassionate use early access, meaning discussions with decision makers and industry on which data should be added to the minimum data set, but focusing on treatments and which dictionaries of medicines and outcomes would be needed to inform on the effect of medicine. So I think this step-by-step approach, but always starting by a kind of scientific advice on how the data source could evolve to satisfy the expectations on different stakeholders is the possible way forward.
Thank you, Francois. So the importance there of a minimum data set, but having the possibility to evolve. And on a previous meeting for Real World Evidence for Decisions, we were hearing about disease registries where they have a standard new treatment module, and that can be important as well as new treatments come on board. Maurizio.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you were introducing a very important question, and in particular, the fact that we really need a little bit to change the way that we are making the registry, and probably the ERN registry are going in this way. First of all, I think that it is important that registries are interoperable. Diseases are, not only on a single field, for example, metabolic, but I mean, the disorders are actually crossing different specialties. So one important thing is that the different way of collecting data can be interoperable. I agree with Francois regarding the minimal data set. This is indeed a key way to start collecting important data that all the registries need to have in order to create the epidemiological way. Another important issue is that, and this is also another point of the ERN registries, is the flexibility and the modulability of the registry. I mean, the platform really need to to be useful and flexible whenever you have a project that is necessary to collect data for a clinical history rather than development of a therapy or whatever. So you create a module without altering the entire platform of the registry, and you collect all the data in that module that can be used for your usage. The third one is sustainability. To have data, enough data, it's a cost, but it is an investment. So I think that the cost of a registry, the maintenance of a registry, need to be seen as not as a cost, but as an investment for science and for the patients. So we really need to have a better attention, I think, at the European level to these registries, not to overcrowd the world of registries, but to ameliorate the registry that we have in order that really they can be more useful to the community and to the companies and to the scientists.
Thank you, Maurizio. Many very good points there. And reiterating what you said importantly, that registries are a really important scientific tool. So we need to invest in them like we do in other areas of science. And we can, if we shape them in a certain way, but make sure they're interoperable, that allows us to collect the data we need across different decision makers. I think Wim was next and then Nicole.
Yeah, so from our perspective, we have also what can you do to ensure that in the registry are the data which we would need to actually make it useful for decision making, but also balancing to the fact that you don't want to overburden the system. And we always use the example from at a Christmas tree, where you then actually have too many balls, and at some moment the Christmas tree just falls over because it's too heavy. And that's something which can happen with registries if you're not very cautious. And we've seen that in oncology, for instance. So what we have done as examples, that we have worked very closely with registry holders to come to what we would call a minimal data set or core outcome set. It's how you actually define it, where you think, well, this is the minimum which we would like to have, which would help all of us. And even then, sometimes you might get actually a lot of information you want to get. So you have to be very critical on what you really need. And also you need to be very careful on what is actually being collected in clinical practice and what's the additional work you want to do. And so we also have tried to find out what can we do to actually make those registries as much as possible just reliant on what's already in the electronic health records, and only have additional information like, for instance, quality of life measurements, which is of interest for us, only as additional, but only to try that kind of additional work, only take that as limited as possible. So the strategy will be minimal data set, finding out where you can rely on what's already in the system, and then only add what you would really need. But it's still a process we need to do for different diseases. Well, even if the data is interoperable, you still have to decide what kind of data you would need for specific disease. And we have tried that, and it seems to work, but it's not an easy process to do that for individual registries.
Thank you, Wim. So that important point of where a health system has good electronic records, to make the most of those so that we're avoiding duplication, but obviously then also need investment in that data collection as well, the administrative kind of data collection. Nicole.
Yeah, and thanks for all the speakers ahead of time. I mean, I think I might just add just a couple of notes. I do very much agree with the core or minimum data set. I think that the interoperability is so important, but we also then have to agree on very simple things like definitions and coding. And that's something that changes by country and changes by disease. And so if there's some sort of opportunity to do that in a systematic and aligned way, that will help. Because the questions that we would get, for example, if we see a registry that comes to us as a piece of evidence from Spain, our first question will be, what are the governance structures? Do these definitions match our outcome definitions? And so, doing some work on that end would be important. I think sometimes academics also ask more questions than required because they have an opportunity to. So I'm looking at you, Victoria, as an academic, and myself as also an academic looking in the mirror. We tend to have that, oh, why don't we ask everything under the sun? And the reality is that's not feasible. And the burden to answer all of those questions and the utility, what will you do with all those questions and answers along the way? I think that's important. I think the collaboration with partners to come up with those kinds of core or meaningful outcomes is really quite important, so that we are moving from perhaps where a randomized clinical trial has a surrogate outcome, but really the meaningful outcome might be a patient-reported outcome or an actual clinical outcome that might not have been collected in the trial, which then leads us to, are these opportunities to fill some gaps? That where a randomized clinical trial is not long enough, big enough, and will not tell you all the right answers for something that is a meaningful impact on a patient's life. And so is this an opportunity for registries or real world evidence to collect things as already indicated, quality of life, patient-reported outcomes, things in the societal perspective space, right? We often know a lot of what happens in the healthcare system, but we don't know about caregivers or patient burden. We don't know about lost productivity. There could be opportunities to expand the kind of data rather than just always thinking you're needing to replicate it to validate an outcome, for example.
Thanks, Nicole. And I'm going to go to Alicia, then quickly back to Maurizio, because we've got lots of questions to get through. So I'm going to ask you to keep your answers brief. Alicia.
Yeah, no, Karen, just one additional point, meaning on one side, fully agree on the need to have a minimal core of assessment, in particular when it comes to the outcome measure. On the other, I think in terms of characterizing the patient population, so collecting the information relevant to characterize the different patient subgroups is very important in my view, meaning that is one of the biggest added value potentially of registry compared to randomized studies. So heterogeneity of the condition can be well described over time by registry. And so this is, I think, something to be kept in mind.
Absolutely. And Nicole mentioned that about context. Context is actually key for HTA payers to understand. And we see much more use of real world evidence in that field. All of our research is showing that we all want to know how many patients we have in our own country, where they are, what treatments they're getting, so that we can understand the added benefit of a new treatment. Maurizio.
Yeah, 30 seconds to say that we need to train our young physician and students to the importance of registry, because we are not trained at all. At least myself as a 1900 physician, I was not trained for a registry connection. But now that we have artificial intelligence and the data are really important, we need to train our students that it is a good clinical practice to collect the data in a proper way to be used and reused for the benefit of the patient. This is something that it is always underestimated, but it's important we start.
Maurizio, that's a fabulous point, and it's actually one of our actions from Real World Evidence for Decisions, that we're trying to, in a sense, infiltrate medical training programs to increase the understanding of the value of these data for a whole range of purposes to improve patient care. I'm going to do one quick question, then I'm going to hand over to Victoria, because there's a couple of questions coming in around, which I think are around access to registries. So people saying, can the patient community access registry? Who can access this? How does that work? Even if a patient, I've been involved with a patient group that actually funded the registry, but found it difficult to understand how their data was being used. And the questions they wanted answers couldn't get answered from the registry. So I wonder if others have kind of views on this. Francois, you mentioned governance. What is your experience from a patient organization perspective?
Well, it really depends on the relation between the patient group and the managers of the registry, but things will change with the European Health Data Space and the data access bodies. It's the way I understand it. It's no longer each registry that will decide who can access the data or not. It's this data access body protecting the general public interest who will receive the request. And I think this can include questions coming from patient organizations. Of course, partnerships with academics is welcome because it's not that easy to question a registry. You need to get it organized. You need to have an algorithm to work, to know how it works, etc. But in theory, patient organizations can question registries, can pass the questions they have to the registries there, and if there is an obstacle to them accessing the registry, the data access bodies will be there to arbitrate and to refer how to access which data and for what purpose.
And I would add to that actually HTA bodies want to be able to ask those questions as well. And one of the things we've learned is we're often working in federated networks. If we're working across diseases, actually creating a research question that is appropriate for those kind of data is a challenge. And we're all learning how to ask research questions in new ways. So we need to share our experiences of that as well. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Wim, and then I'll hand over to Victoria to ask the next question from the participants.
Yeah, I was just a little bit motivated by your last remark. I think we have to very carefully think what we can actually do to find out whether certain questions are feasible for the type of data. And so sometimes we say, well, we have data and nice to have data and we do something in it, or we motivate a question which we subsequently say, well, this is not the kind of data which we actually can use to answer that question. So have this so we are currently working, thinking, well, for instance, if you want to do effectiveness studies on these registries, what is really needed? And therefore, for instance, the new target trial emulation approaches could really help to think very carefully whether your data actually fit to actually look at effectiveness questions. So there are new ways to actually doing that, and probably more is possible than we think is now.
Excellent. So I think I'll just jump in quickly and say also, coming from my registry expertise in the background, I think the landscape has been evolving. We see guidance from HTA, we see guidance from regulators, we see the patient voice becoming more central, we see changes in trials and incorporation of patient-reported outcomes. So this whole concept is moving along with patients having, bringing their experience. We know they are experts in their diseases. How do we incorporate that? How do we bring that and bringing, actually patients into that governance framework where, I come from a traditional academic background in academic registries where that wasn't always the case. And I think it is shifting. And I would say, every registry I have built, 15 in the last 2 years, every single one has patients sitting in that governance body where they are part of that work. And, some of that is driven, by partners like CDA, requesting that in submissions. And so I think that piece is evolving and growing. I think, each community, as Francois mentioned, there are communities where the patient organizations and the clinicians don't play well together, and trying to, bring those voices together is difficult, but it is solvable. I wanted to transition just to ask a question in that vein around, we had a few questions coming in around quality of life, around, what is a meaningful outcome to the patient community? How do we centralize that patient voice, and how do particular HTA bodies, view and see patient-reported data and the quality of that to help support decision making? So how do you incorporate quality of life? How do you incorporate data coming, from patient submissions and the value of that in decision making? And maybe go to Nicole first, since you already had your hand up, maybe about something I said previously, but.
No, I mean, I'm happy to go transition to this one. I mean, I think, we certainly, this is part of the information that you don't often get from a randomized clinical trial, right? So the impact of the disease and the technology on somebody's quality of life. And so the opportunity to learn and understand what actually is the burden, or what is the impact of the disease and or the technology on a patient and patient community and caregivers is something that's really valuable and provides us with that context. And earlier, I talked about our deliberative framework. This is that sort of unmet need. This is that equity and ethics kind of component that allows us to incorporate that kind of information into the way that we would deliberate about the value of a technology. So really important for all of us. I think that the challenge, and this goes back to our interoperability conversation, which tool, how, are they all the same tools? It's all, is it a general or a generic specific quality of life tool, and then a disease specific quality of life tool, and then the agreement within the communities, whether that is the patient community or the registry community or the clinician community that might be running the registries. How do we make sure that we're using the right kind of tools to help us? And often when, as somebody who, as a health technology assessment organization, we're faced with new tools that we might not have understood if they're valid, or they actually answer the question that we're trying to unpack. And so those are the kinds of things that as we do our appraisal, it is how do we ensure that we have that right information, because it's such an important decision.
Yeah, maybe to add, I think that I mostly agree with Nicole. One of the issues, I think we have been very careful to see whether patient-reported outcome measures could be included in those core outcome sets for registries which we're involved in. So the initial answer is, do we want this? Do we think it's relevant? Is yes. I think that subsequently, and I think that actually no one disagrees on having those data in there, but I think the question is, well, how can you ensure that this is being measured correctly? It is measured on the right time and consistently. And what we have seen over time in registries, that many registries struggle with the way of doing that. Do we need to have questionnaires? Should it be part of the electronic health record system of the hospital? Should we use an app for actually getting that information? So I think the question is not whether we should, but how should we ensure that it's good enough to actually use it and it's relevant. And I think then also the question for maybe more clinical effectiveness questions, you would like to have more disease-specific patient-reported outcome measures, while for cost effectiveness, you also would like to have generic prompts. So how do you balance this? There are questions in terms of methodology, but most, I think, in terms of how are you measuring consistently and can you use those data actually for decision making?
And I'll perhaps come in pulling together a couple of questions in the chat. Sort of, can we think to the future? Is there new technology, new digital technologies we could be using that would assist our data collection? So maybe this is a particular question for Maurizio and Alessio. I started in clinical audit 26 years ago, when literally you wrote everything down and it was entered into an Excel spreadsheet. Now we have doctors running around with iPads, etc. Is this going to make it easier? We've got large language models. Somebody's mentioned that earlier. How do we define quality? So is there something in the future that could help us make this easier, that we're collecting data where it occurs, bringing it together through appropriate governance, and then using it for many purposes? Am I naive in thinking that should be possible in the not too distant future?
On the clinical side, I think that we are going more and more on the digitalization of the health records. And whenever you have a full control and verify the health record that can go directly into a registry, not as a typing, but like, for example, an HPO, a human phenotype ontology, where everything is actually codified and not just written, that would be something that can be much easier. It takes quite a lot of funds and resources to do these things, but there are, of course, countries that are developing that throughout the member states. And of course, as I said before, this is also the need of a new mentality and a new awareness on the medical side, to be prepared in using this kind of resources. And so to be fully trained and to be also, going through a qualification and proper training and proper control for that. So I think that we are going in that situation because data is really absolutely needed. And with all the tools, I think that technology is already there. The important thing is actually how to learn to use it. And I'm convinced that this is the future, for the clinical, also to decrease mistakes, misinterpretation, misunderstanding, miscommunication between professionals.
Alessio.
Fully agree with what Professor Kappa said. I think another aspect on which I see a lot of potential for new AI technology, machine learning approaches is on the identification of patients that can be potentially at risk for a condition, and so to speed up diagnosis. But I think that this is coming together with let's say integration of the data and the interoperability of the data, because to have a proper training of the machine learning approaches, we need to have a certain amount of data, in particular for rare condition. At least in Europe, this is feasible only if we are able to integrate information collected in different countries, cannot never run on a single country level. And once we'll be at that stage, I think that can empower a lot the AI approaches, for example, for speeding up diagnosis.
And somebody raised that important question of how all this can help the diagnostic odyssey, which we know is one of the biggest challenges in rare diseases. Unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to hand over to Victoria to ask our final question to each of the panelists. And apologies to those who've written great questions in the Q&A that we haven't had time. And we'll quickly try and type some answers in the next 5 minutes.
Excellent. So thank you all for being here today. And as Karen said, we're just going to wrap up here and really with your final parting thoughts from each of the panelists. So in about 30 seconds, we'd like you, based on what you've heard today, how do you feel your stakeholder group can do better to support use of real-world data in decision making? And we'll start with Francois, I think.
Well, I think there are too few patient advocates really involved in all these discussions, this reflection. It's such an active domain with new innovations, with questions such as when does a new innovation in this field, a new analytic method, become good practice and replace the more conventional ones? The pace of innovation goes so fast that to keep up with progress is a challenge for everyone, for patient advocates even more, hence the need for training, capacity building, and sharing experiences, including with patient advocates.
Excellent. Thanks, Francois. And then from the industry perspective, Alessio.
I think the key message to me is the multi-stakeholder collaboration. And from an industry perspective, I think that just to give two examples, on one side is to have early discussion as possible, for example, with HTA and payers, just to go back to some of the point Wim was previously mentioning about, let's say, how we don't manage data as an afterthought, but we start from the very beginning, having in mind what are the questions that we want to address and how we can collect data coherently and with the methodology that is appropriate. And to go back to other stakeholders, giving back feedback loop for patient and clinician in terms of how we use the data that have been contributing to collect or who have been driving the collection. So it's very important to keep also the motivation about the relevance of collecting data.
Excellent, thank you. And over to HTA, Wim.
Yeah, a few points. I think that for us as HTA bodies, it's crucial to work together on quality and accessibility of international patient registries. And I think in Europe, within under the EU HAR regulation, there are options to just work together. And there we can also set new standards for the quality and completeness of registries, which we want for HTA. And finally, I think we have to put more efforts in the methodology on how to actually use the data for decision making. So what are the data and the outcomes we need to actually use this for decisions about reimbursement?
Excellent. Thanks. And Nicole?
Well, I have the benefit of going last, and everybody took my final thoughts in terms of collaboration and interoperability. But maybe I'll end in something that struck me, what Mauricio highlighted. Training for clinicians, but it's also training for decision makers, right? An opportunity, to understand what is the kind of evidence we need, and it's often based on the question that we need to answer, right? So, is it a comparator? Analysis? Is it an outcome? Is it trying to understand the epidemiology? Is it understanding the utilization? And so that we don't always appraise that kind of evidence with the same kind of lens. And we use sort of a traditional way of thinking about outcomes assessment, and that everything that isn't an RCT has a causality issue. But you don't need an RCT to tell you about utilization or patient-reported outcomes. And so I think we need some training, or we need to be part of the training to ensure that people are aware of those kinds of issues.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicole. And lastly, we'll turn over to the clinician perspective from Maurizio. Starting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's coming from Nicole. I mean, the education is very important, but also I think that the stakeholders been already said, but we need to exploit the programs that we have at the moment. So I think that exploiting the Biotech Act is extremely important, because the Biotech Act is a unique opportunity we have, and the leadership of MEP Andriukaitis will be really crucial for that, being a physician, in valuing the data, the collection of data, the importance of the data organization and the governance to speed up the biotechnology in Europe. So really the exploiting of the existing programs is very important, and the work of all together in these programs is important to really gain leadership and speed up and ameliorate the quality of life of the patients. So, I mean, we have the opportunity, and as I said, it's the time to do it.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for those great thoughts, and particularly to Victoria for helping moderate this great discussion with her wonderful expertise. This session has been recorded, so you'll be able to share it with your colleagues in a few days. There will also be a report written. Real World Evidence for Decisions has its next invitation-only roundtable in June about how can we use real-world evidence to explain patient benefit. That's been one of the questions that was asked a lot in the Q&A today. And if you're interested in attending, please do contact the Secretariat. But I'd just like to end by saying I have a particular interest in rare diseases, and there are many people that say you can't collect real-world data in rare diseases, the populations are too small. This panel has shown that that is not the case. It's actually incredibly important for us to have real-world data to help us understand the context of specific rare diseases, to understand the treatments that are given, the care pathways that patients are currently undergoing, and to understand the real life effectiveness of new treatments that are coming on board. So I think we need to harness the potential of new technologies coming forward, but particularly, as Maurizio said, we as a community need to engage in the policy opportunities that present themselves, like the Biotech Act. And I think Maurizio, Real World Evidence for Decisions, would like to offer an arm to you to say we are here to help you with our multi-stakeholder learning network in whatever way we can moving forward. So let's keep the collaboration going. And thank you all for your very active participation as panelists, and to all those online who have contributed great questions. Thank you very much.